The kingdom of heaven will be like this. Be careful. Be careful of the future setting of this parable. Because this is not so much a story about the future as it is about the present, and how our behavior here and now irrevocably shapes our future. I want you to flip ahead to the end of the syllabus, the teacher says. I want to point out the final assignment for the semester. Every year, a handful of students wait until the last week of class to start thinking about this project. And I want you to know that if you do that, you send me a frantic email, it's going to be too late. There are no extensions. You're going to fail the assignment. You're just not going to have time to get it done in time. I'm letting you know right now. We're in the waning weeks of the church year, pre-Advent, as it were. You'll notice that this morning a few Advent hymns have already snuck their way into the liturgy. Within the Advent season, and all of its looking forward and expectant focuses, the real focus of passages like this morning's gospel is how we conduct ourselves now in this time of our mortal life, to borrow a phrase from the collect for the first Sunday of Advent. According to Jesus, Christians are concerned with the present not as an end to itself, a sort of live for the moment mentality, but because we know that our present decisions will have eternal consequences. That is what separates the wise from the foolish bridesmaids in this parable. Not whether they fell asleep, they all fell asleep, but how prepared they were. We know virtually nothing about Jewish wedding practices in Jesus' day, except that they involved these lavish parties that would go on for days at a time. Weddings were a major public event, often involving entire villages and communities, which makes the unreadiness of these 5 foolish bridesmaids all the more astonishing. All eyes are on them. You had one job, you can hear the bridegroom say in frustration. Everyone in the village has been preparing in one way or another for this moment. But a full half of the bridesmaids are completely unprepared. Here's where the story gets confusing. Why couldn't the 5 whose lamps burned out rely on the light of others to help guide them? Isn't it uncharitable, we wonder, of the 5 wise bridesmaids not to share their oil? Surely they could have come up with some sort of solution that allowed everyone to participate in the festivities. Our text translates these as lamps, but they could also just as easily be translated as torches. In fact, looking at Middle Eastern wedding practices, in the present, commentators suspect that torches might actually make a little bit more sense. That maybe if they were torches, they would have served a greater purpose than simply guiding these bridesmaids to see where they were going. It's possible that when they arrived at the wedding, the torches were placed outside as a way of helping guide other guests into the wedding, or perhaps the torches themselves were placed around the perimeter of the wedding itself, so that throughout the night people could see what was going on. They'd be placed in brackets. People would be able to enjoy the festivities well into the beginning of the new day. If that's the case, if all the oil would have been equally split, they would have run out well before morning came. And so what seems like an initially selfish response, I did right, and so I'm not gonna pick up the pieces of your mistakes here. I'm not gonna share my oil with you. That response is kind of turned on its head. The wise bridesmaids, in fact, saved the wedding by refusing to split their oil, with those who did not buy enough. The mistake the foolish bridesmaids made was not to count the cost. And when it mattered most, to hold back. Notice that the problem is not their inability to get more oil. Despite it being late at night, everyone's up. This is a big to-do for the whole town. So they're able to go to the merchants. They have the resources to buy more oil, but by the time they do, it's too late. In the end, this parable is about the terror of knowing that we could have done more, but that we chose not to. That we lived too much for ourselves and thought that the little that was left over for God would be sufficient. It's a costly thing to let our lights so shine before men that they may see our good works and praise our Father who is in heaven. It is a costly thing to live lives that show others the way to the bridegroom's wedding banquet. And it turns out that it's an even costlier mistake not to live such a life. Those who were once included as bridesmaids find themselves excluded in the end. Lord, Lord, they call out. But the door is shut, and the bridegroom does not recognize them. He says, I don't know who you are. You weren't there when you were supposed to be. I don't know who you are. And what's truly terrifying about this parable is the fact that this parable is not about those who chose to sleep in this morning or go to brunch rather than being in a place like this. This parable is directed at those who bothered to get up early on a Sunday morning and to get dressed up as nice as you all did and to do the right thing. It's a story about those who are invited to the banquet and who are awaiting the bridegroom's return. In a few moments, we are going to witness a new Christian be born. And after the baptism, the priest will hand the family a lit candle and offer these words: "Receive the light of Christ, that when the bridegroom cometh, thou mayest go forth to meet him, and see that thou dost keep the grace of thy baptism." With those words, we commission every new Christian who is born anew through these waters. See to it that what we do here this morning is not in vain. Keep your loins girded, keep your lamps trimmed. While the church has seen the oil in this story as a metaphor for all manner of virtuous and godly living, it's important to point out that there is a real monetary thrust in this passage. Being prepared for the bridegroom means that you spend your money and your resources on the right things. Again, it's not that the foolish bridesmaids didn't have the money to buy more oil or that they couldn't buy more oil. They ended up doing just that. It's that they held back when it mattered most, when the time was right. As one commentator describes it, the foolish bridesmaids have adopted the prudent ways of this world, living for the moment, going for the gusto, and allowing this world's standards to define the good life. Well, you know, it's stewardship season. If you're a part of St. David's, if you come here on a regular basis, you should have all received mailers in the mail this past week. In the weeks leading up to this, you've received some emails with much the same information. Stewardship season. And our theme is that love gives. Love, it turns out, is not a vague, amorphous sort of reality, but it's a concrete practice. And as ethicists tell us, when we want to adopt or learn to practice a certain virtue, we don't do it by trying to practice that virtue. We do it by practicing other habits that virtue might ride on the back of. So as counterintuitive as it might seem, we don't become more loving by trying to be loving. We become more loving by doing the things that make us more loving people. And in the scriptures, We see the example of Jesus. We're told that God so loved the world that he gave. And in a beloved offertory sentence, when we jar you back into what we're doing here in the liturgy at the end of the announcements, I'll often say, walk in love. As Paul tells the Ephesians, as Christ loved us and gave himself. Love of God and love of neighbor is expressed in our ability to give generously of ourselves. And so, in our booklet here, we walk through some of the importance, some of the reasons that's incredibly important for us in this moment in our life together as a church. Maybe you've seen some of those, but if you haven't, they're important to celebrate here. They are big sort of yay God moments for us as a congregation. We recognize that of the people who come here on a regular basis, 50% of you are engaged in one of our confirmation classes or in one of our small groups this fall. That's a big deal. That means that not only are we growing numerically, but we're growing in depth as well. That we are a congregation that is rooted in the apostles' teaching and doctrine, breaking of bread and in the prayers. That we are a congregation that doesn't just care about superficial realities, but of real substantial realities. And you do too, because 50% of you are engaged in some sort of adult formation throughout the week here at St. David's. That also means that we have one of the largest confirmation groups coming up here that we've had since the 90s. It's a big deal. It's an exciting thing. 23 total adults and youth preparing for confirmation, which is the most that we've had since 1995. It's a big deal. Our weekly attendance has grown by 12% in the last year, which in a post-COVID world, that's a big deal. Maybe not something to fully celebrate, but an important thing to note, that puts us in the top 6% of Episcopal churches. This congregation here gathered is well over twice the size of the average Episcopal church. Our 8 o'clock congregation, call it congregation, we're all a congregation, but the 8 o'clock service of people who attend that regularly, well over twice the size of the average Episcopal church. And again, maybe that's one to kind of play close to the chest. Episcopalians don't have a lot to be proud of, but that's something we have to be proud of. The youth group at St. David's, we went on our first mission trip since COVID. It was an incredible moment. We and our youth here, as we've gotten some kids who have grown up a little bit here. Our youth has become a sort of active group in the congregation again. Not something that could be said right after COVID, after the pandemic and everything surrounding the pandemic sort of gutted our youth group. We're building back, and we're building back very strong. It's an exciting thing to say. It's an exciting thing to have baptisms on a regular basis and to be the sort of vibrant congregation that we are. To be expanding our outreach with Norwegian pilots who are here learning how to fly planes, and your hospitality with them has been an incredible thing in the past year. The fact that in the past year we've added 2 scholarship singers or 2 staff singers to our choir so that we can do more difficult and beautiful music that gives glory and honor to God. That's an exciting thing. Our 8 o'clock service has added a 3rd nursery worker, right? Because there are so many babies who are being potty trained right now, and they need more workers at 8 o'clock, of all times. That is an exciting thing. And so with all the things that we rejoice over here at St. David's, with all the ways that God is working in you and amongst our community, that opportunity comes as something to steward. It's both an opportunity and a challenge to us. Because as we anticipate the coming year, as we anticipate both the inflation that we're seeing, the rising costs that we'll experience with entering into the new building, just everything that's gone up here in the past number of years, we anticipate that our budget's going to have to increase by 10%. That's a chunk. That's a chunk. But I'll promise you, and if our treasurer is here, he'd promise you the same thing. It's a very lean budget. It's a very lean budget. But it's an opportunity for each of us to to step out in faith. It's an opportunity for each of us to seize the moment that's before us as an opportunity to make more Christians than we ever have before as we prepare for a really big year for us as a congregation. And so we're inviting you, as you consider what your pledge is going to be for the coming year, to pray over that long and hard. If you don't pledge to St. David's, we invite you to become a first-time pledger. What that does is that allows us to budget a bit better, and it keeps you honest about what you're giving. If you make a plan, it's easier to stick to that plan rather than saying, well, I got this here. I'll toss this in the offering plate. I'm able to give this right now. We find if we make time for the right sort of habits and things in our lives, it's a lot easier to do them when we have a plan and we stick to it. If you already pledge here at St. David's, we'd encourage you to consider increasing your pledge. If our budget is increasing by 10%, that means that some of us need to step up a little bit. And I look at myself and our family in that. For our family, that means increasing what we're currently giving by 11%. I encourage you to help consider doing the same or more as you're able to. For some of you, that might mean making your way up to a tithe or going beyond a tithe. It's important to say that as uncomfortable as it is to talk about money, we would never have to if all of us gave a tithe of 10%. The church would have an abundance, an superabundance of resources to meet the needs both in our immediate community and beyond. So as you go through each year, it's important, I think, to put into practice a sort of pathway that leads us to meeting that biblical standard of giving 10% back to God, which means we feel that. We certainly feel that. With a family with children, we feel that. But it's only when our giving becomes a true sacrifice that it has the ability to change us. And the promise that we see in our parable today from Jesus is that everything that's given in the end will not be lost. It's what's grasped onto that will be lost. The promise that we see in this parable is that nothing you surrender to God in this life will be lost for eternity. Only what you don't surrender, only what you don't give will be left behind on the day of his return. And as we're taught to pray in our own prayer book, collect we heard a few weeks ago, grant us, O Lord, not to mind earthly things, but to love things heavenly. Even now, while we are placed among things that are passing away, to cleave to those that shall abide. Amen.